Nevin Dawson. He's with the Forest Management Division of the University of Maryland Extension. He's actually right down the street from here, and he's going to talk about managing your forest for habitat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. All right, so we've heard a lot about early successional habitat and about timber harvesting, but I'm going to go into a little more detail on how to actually do the timber harvesting and some of the other benefits associated with it. First, I'm going to start off with the principles of succession. You've heard some of these already, but I'm going to go into a little more detail on how it actually works. I'm going to talk about our current landscape. You've heard a lot of that already. More about forest management, goals and actions, that sort of thing, and then 5 things you can do this weekend. So, the principles of succession. Natural areas change over time, whether you want them to or not. That's just the fact of life. You can accelerate the process of succession, and I'll talk about how to do that. But basically, in the most basic form of allowing this to happen is just stop mowing, even if it's a manicured lawn, and eventually, in most conditions, it'll turn into a mature forest over many years. And the mechanics behind this is just the way that some species need full sunlight and do very well in it, and other species can do okay without full sunlight. So we have shade-tolerant species. Those are the slow-growing ones that can survive under the forest canopy on the forest floor. We have shade-intolerant species, which cannot survive under the forest floor, but when they have full sun, they grow very quickly and outcompete those shade-tolerant species. So we have this gradual transition from shade-intolerant species to shade-tolerant species. And each of those stages has a different species composition and has a different suite of values in terms of wildlife habitat, aesthetics, and recreation. And if you have a small wooded lot, you're probably not going to be able to have all these different stages, but you can look at the landscape around your property and figure out how you can contribute to the landscape as a whole. So here's just a graphic to illustrate. Usually, if you're starting from bare soil, you disc the soil. What comes in naturally first is annual plants, and then we have over maybe a year or two perennial plants and grasses coming in, and over a few years we have shrubs coming in. So one by one, these are more and more shade-tolerant species that are able to outcompete the previous class. Then we have softwood trees like pines, and when we start having these bigger plants coming in, they start to form a taller canopy. And as they form that taller canopy, the smaller plants on the ground are shaded out and they can't compete anymore, so that class of plants dies out. And then we have the same thing happening here, where under these pine trees, in ideal conditions, we have hardwood trees like the oaks and beeches that are able to get a start, so that when these pine trees are either removed by people or they die naturally, those oak trees, those shade-tolerant species are able to get their start because they're already seedlings there. Okay, so what's the current landscape look like? Well, we've talked about most of this. We have fewer windrows, we have bigger ag fields, we have less fallow land. Or the fallow land that was early successional habitat has continued with succession and has become mature forest. We have more development and older forests. And you saw a graph that had some kind of the same information earlier, but here's the different size classes of trees. So salt timber is bigger than 11 inches, so on and so forth. What's DBH? Diameter of breast height. So that's measuring a tree at 4.5 feet above the ground. And here's the different classes by that measurement. So ideally, we have about half of our forest in saw timber. We have about a quarter in pole timber, so a little smaller, and then another quarter in saplings and seedlings combined. Well, what we actually have, and these numbers might be a little old, but it's more like 71% in saw timber, so mostly older forest, and only 19 and 10% in the smaller stuff. So this is the trend that you saw illustrated earlier that you've heard talked about once more in one more form. Why is this happening? Well, one part that goes way back is fire prevention. As people living in houses and structures that we pay a lot of money for we don't like fire. It's something that we try to exclude from our landscape, usually as much as possible, except in certain small areas where we do prescribe burning. What that means is that we've eliminated one of nature's natural reset buttons. There's still occasional tornadoes and hurricanes, windstorms, that sort of thing that naturally resets a forest from old growth or mature forest back to early successional stage. But fire was a big one that we no longer have. And even when Indians were the ruling group of people, they set big fires intentionally to make better hunting habitat and for a lot of other reasons. So once Europeans started moving in, the amount of fire, wildfire, decreased pretty dramatically. So that was one reason that we started losing a lot of our early successional habitat. Social perceptions. Most people, we have this green movement, which is a great thing. Most people are aware of all the reasons that we should save our natural resources, but somehow what got tied into that is that we shouldn't cut trees anymore. And that's a great concept if we're cutting trees to build Walmarts in most cases. But usually when we're cutting trees and then we're going to replant them, that's actually a great thing to do because we're using a renewable resource and we're creating early successional habitat. But that message it kind of got overshadowed by all the other messages out there. In Maryland especially, we have a lot of small forested parcels. The average forest parcel size in Maryland is somewhere around 14 acres. So very small. This means that all these folks, all these folks that have all these small parcels have a very difficult time, even if they are aware of all the benefits of forest management and they want to do a great job managing their forest. It's still really hard for them to even find the professionals who are willing to come out and do work on such a small acreage because it's hard for a logger to actually make a profit because of all the transportation costs for their equipment and setup time and all that. And also, these folks who own smaller land lots usually just aren't as aware of the benefits of management as folks who own larger forest land. And then on top of all this, we have a recent decline in timber markets, which means that folks who want to cut their timber and sell it, a lot of them are waiting for the prices to go up. So that means there's more emphasis on thinning, and a lot of times that can help habitat, but it doesn't necessarily. And this is compounded even farther on the eastern shore because a lot of the pine prices were actually artificially inflated until the last few years. So folks have seen that even bigger crash in prices than in other parts of the state, and they're going to keep waiting and waiting for those prices to come back up, when in fact, right now they're more equal to the rest of the state, and they probably won't ever get back to that original level. So the result of all this is a landscape with missing pieces. And if we have that missing successional stage, we have missing plant species and missing structural complexes, which equals missing animal species. So what can you do? Well, you can create that missing piece. Grassland in this area can attract up to 20 rare bird species. And they've had a lot of success with this at Chester River Research Center, which is also known as Chino Farms, which Bob talked a lot about. Of course, the quail was successful and had the recent problems, but we also have hornlark, grasshopper sparrow, field sparrow, thistle, and vesper sparrow, which are all great rare species to have. And they've had a special success with the grasshopper sparrow. I think it was Bob mentioned that fescue is not really a good thing to plant along with native grasses. The same is true for switchgrass because it tends to pump things up. Unless you if you take care to space them out, it might be all right, but you just have to be careful with it. So the easiest way is just to leave the edges of your ag fields fallow, and this creates that edge habitat that all these species like so much. And also consider reinstalling these windrows where they've been removed in a lot of cases, because that's more edge habitat, and buffers along streams and so forth. And then what I'm going to concentrate on here is timber harvest. But before you jump into that, you want to step back and think things out a bit and really consider what your goals are. You may know that you want more quail or more woodcock on your property, but there's probably other things that you also want to accomplish on your land that they may not be in the forefront of your mind, but you want to consider them in the planning process. And you want a written plan at the end of the day. So I'm just going to use these 5 categories that the Forest Service has come up with. Generally, most landowners' goals for their land comes within one of these 5 categories, or several of them. So the first is soil and water quality. You've heard a lot about riparian buffers, I'm sure, and the reason that they're such an important and big topic is that trees and other plants do such a good job of preventing both sediment and excess nutrients from going from farm fields or housing developments into a water body, like a stream or lake. And that's why there's all these programs to encourage landowners to have these riparian buffers. So having trees and forests along water is a great way to improve or maintain soil and water quality. Fish and wildlife habitat is what we're focused on today, so that's an obvious one. Recreation and aesthetics is another one to consider. A lot of times, good wildlife habitat is not what a lot of people consider to be a beautiful landscape, especially when we're talking about brush piles and logging slash. That can be great habitat, but a lot of your average passersby might look at it and think that's ugly. So there's a balance there. Do you want really good habitat, or is it also important for you to have really good looking forest or land in general? Forest products, that's the timber aspect generally, but there's also non-timber forest products you might think about, like shiitake mushrooms or ginseng, that sort of thing. And then passive management is kind of the do-nothing approach. And for some people, that's what they're really into. They want to say, my land is there, I'm not going to do anything to it because I want it to be natural. But what are some possible side effects of that approach?
Just have mature forests, no undergrowth.
Yeah, so we just have mature forests with no undergrowth. Anything else come to mind?
Non-native invasive species.
Exactly. I mean, no matter how much you keep your hands off of your forest land, all the other people in your community and in the world around you are still doing things that influence your land. So all these invasive species, it's highly unlikely that just because you're not doing anything to your forest land, that invasive species will not be able to make an impact on that land. And so that's just something to consider if you're thinking about the passive management approach. And again, some goals are accomplished at the expense of other goals. So sometimes you'll have to make a balance between these 2 or more of these categories. Other things you just want to think about when you're considering whether to do any management actions or not. Forest stagnation is when trees kind of grow and they kind of get so crowded that they don't just start competing like they normally would. They all just kind of slow down and stop altogether. And I'll show you a graphic of that in a second. Economic return is also a big thing to think about. Is that important to you? Do you need to make some money off of your land, help pay your taxes, or make a little more besides? Is old growth habitat important to you? This is another habitat. We're not focusing on this today, but it is also a limited resource. There are species like the Marva fox squirrel that require longer rotation length, more like 70, 80 years in loblolly pine in mixed forests. So if you're managing only for early successional habitat, it is at the expense of some other species. So again, it's a balance. When you harvest, there is some danger to soil and water quality, but hiring a good logger and a good forester should limit that mostly. So in short, you want to think about how will the management actions that you take affect the value of your land in each of those 5 goal categories. Even the ones that you're not too concerned about, you still want to consider how it's going to be affected.